Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, the UK COVID-19 inquiry is currently sitting in Edinburgh, the Scottish part of that inquiry, as it probes the devolved administration's response to the pandemic. Joining me to discuss this is consultant pathologist Dr. Clare Craig. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you, Neil.
Have you been keeping up with the testimony, let's say, that's been being given to both of these inquiries?
I have been watching it, and it has been really quite shocking. And it really stands in contrast to the English inquiry, because these are real people telling their own stories in a way that we haven't seen in England.
What has been the nature of the inquiry in England? What's been the style and the content then?
So in England, what we've predominantly seen is people who are already in positions of power going and defending their decision-making. Whereas what we're seeing in Scotland are people whose lives are affected getting to finally be heard. I've
seen some of it, and I'll be the first to admit, I haven't been on top of it as much as I should have done as another observer. It's unbelievable testimony that people are coming forward with about. It's beyond neglect.
It really is, and it's really, really important, because what they're doing is lifting the lid on what happened in care homes in spring 2020. And that is such a fundamental part of the COVID story. So 46% of the deaths in Scotland that were attributed to COVID happened in care homes. So if that story isn't quite the one that we've been told, it's important that it gets heard.
Jasmine, it is quite astonishing, is it not, that these stories are being told, and by and large, the general population still are unaware.
It drives me nuts, because, as you say, this is really important. We've got people, real ordinary people who have suffered terrible things, actually getting the chance to say something. But the mainstream media is not covering it. And I think it's because, generally speaking, it can't bear to. The editors, the journalists can't bear to admit that they were wrong and that they were part of this, because it's not just the care homes, it's not just the medical establishment, it's the government, it is the media, it's the civil service. Again, this sort of big blob of individuals who all were speaking and thinking in lockstep, and now it's being thrown back in their faces and they don't like it.
Clare, what was happening? I mean, the people to whom this was happening, you would regard as amongst the most vulnerable in any of our communities. And what the treatment that seemed to be meted out to them is beyond neglect, to the point where it just seems cruel. What are we looking at here in terms of the testimony as described?
So I look at it broadly as falling into two camps. So on the one hand, we had people who were given do not resuscitate orders. And the reality is that most resuscitation is not successful. And when it is successful, you often need intensive care support. But that happened at the same time as hospitals were denying admission to anybody that had a do not resuscitate order. So it wasn't that it was do not resuscitate, it became do not give any medical care to these people. So that was one catastrophe. And then the other side of it was what was happening with end-of-life medication, whereby people who, we had the protocols that were binary in terms of what could happen if somebody deteriorated. And if they weren't going to be actively treated and put on ventilators, then they were to be given end-of-life medication. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody in a care home with COVID ended up on end-of-life medication. And there would have been some for whom that would have been appropriate because they were going to die. But it seems that there is a bigger middle portion here than I had appreciated at first, because there are so many people who've been telling stories about their loved ones who, under other circumstances, would have been treated very differently, and who, for lack of visitors, which was a big deal, did not have the support and care they normally would have had, and were being given these drugs, which are very powerful and dangerous, and which palliative care experts were calling out in May 2020, because these protocols were very explicit about how you accelerated the drug, but said nothing about winding it down. And these drugs suppress the respiratory drive. So where they have a great usage in end-of-life care when you've got cancer, it's a different story when you've got an acute respiratory infection, and the drive to breathe is incredibly important in terms of survival.
Yeah, so Sorry,
I'm just thinking, so essentially you're saying that really quite large cohorts of people were being murdered. I mean, honestly, that's the way it sounds to me.
So I think that's really, really difficult term to be using.
Yeah, sorry.
And I don't think that the people who were giving out these medications had any ill intent.
Mm-hmm.
I genuinely don't think there was any ill intent in what they were doing. It was how these decisions were being made is the problem. So first of all, you've got people who, the doctors, were giving out these prescriptions beforehand, getting people already ready for lockdown, and then were very much practicing at a distance at the other end of a phone. And so people who were making the decisions about the likelihood of living or dying did not necessarily have the expertise to be doing that.
That really begins to touch on what frightens me about what happened. It was the fact that these places, a lot of these care homes became places in which the elderly were lost and isolated. The normal engagements with the family, who have the best interests of those people closest to their hearts, were left out of the equation. And that these people, often with dementia, often in a very precarious health position, were isolated in every way that mattered.
Absolutely. And when I first heard these stories, I will admit to being very sceptical about it, because as a doctor, what I've experienced is that when somebody dies, you often have sort of two types of relative. You have the ones that have been at the bedside and who've heard all of the details and have followed the story in depth, who understand what happened. And then you have the sort of relatives at a distance, however far that may have been, who very often don't quite get it and feel, aggrieved about the process and want to blame. And so when I first heard these stories, I thought that this was because of mass communication breakdown because of what we had done. If you remove the relatives from a dying situation, you're going to create that problem. But having heard all these testimonies where the story's the same, again and again and again, it becomes, I just think I was wrong on that. I don't think it was a communication problem. I think there was more to it than that. There was more going on there.
And Jasmine, it felt like yet another example of why locking down in the way that was forced upon us, it's another example of the way in which that was disastrous.
Every way. Honestly, I cannot think of a really good reason to lock down anybody, any of us, whatever cohort. And particularly in this case, where we had so many stories, and even I've seen videos of people, at the window of the care homes trying to touch each other and they can't, and physically held away from each other. How is that good in any way, anyway, for people who are trying to get better? It's like we now realise it's a good idea to bring dogs and cats, pets in to help people. The very least that you could do is to help people by having them very close to their loved ones. That's very often what makes them better. Forget about the drugs and everything.